September 1, 1892, St. John Daly's son, St. John, New Brunswick, Canada. 1 blood spot. That but the size of a small pinhead and not certainly human blood. All the direct evidence against Lizzie Borden. Professor Wood's testimony is strong for the defense. No trace of poison, no blood on the hatchet. Fall River, August 30th. Lizzie A. Borden will not testify on her own behalf at the hearing now going on at Fall River. That was decided by her lawyers this afternoon after District Attorney Knowlton had finished reading the statement made by the accused young woman at the inquest held 2 weeks ago. The lawyers were helped in their decision by the startling evidence given by Professor Edward Wood, showing that but 2 almost infinitesimal spots of blood were found on everything submitted to him, which came from the Borden house, having a direct bearing in detecting the guilty person. The case of the government was closed this afternoon, and the defense commenced putting in its evidence. The state thought that it had a bit of direct evidence in the claw hatchet found down cellar, with 2 hairs and spots that looked like blood on it. The state was so positive that the very weapon had been found that the warrant for Lizzie's arrest read that she killed her father with a certain weapon, to wit, a certain hatchet. How quickly that bit of direct evidence faded into thin air when Professor Wood got his microscope on it. He found that the supposed bloodstains were merely rust spots. That of the 2 hairs on it, one came from an animal, probably a cow, and that the other had disappeared in transit. The case against Lizzie has thus far been made up largely of suspicious circumstances which might, in the opinion of many, warrant an accusation, but never, unless backed up by a further development of the government's hand, a conviction. Perhaps, though, Mr. Knowlton wanted to squeeze through the preliminary hearing without showing the slightest possible portion of his evidence. If that was his object, he certainly has shown little enough, for the motive and direct evidence, beyond that which related to the fact of the killing, have been entirely lacking and must to some extent be produced if any success is looked for by the prosecution at a trial, providing the matter is pushed along to that. Some peculiar threads were left ungathered in Lizzie's statement, according to the report Miss White made of her remarks. At the hearing, she says when she got downstairs that morning, she did not see Morse, but she did see her father, mother, and Maggie. Her mother was dusting in the dining room, and told her that she had been upstairs and finished the work in the chambers. Lizzie thinks she saw her about 9, but not after that. Mrs. Borden disappears, and Lizzie and Bridget kept on about their work. Mrs. Borden was killed about 9:30 o'clock, according to the doctor's testimony. Lizzie, according to her own story, was upstairs in her room about that time, putting away some clean clothes and sewing a loop on one of her garments. She stayed there only a short time and then went down to the kitchen again. She said she did not go upstairs a second time, but she made 3 or 4 statements about being on the 2nd floor, on the flight of stairs, and in the kitchen where her father came in, and finally decided that she was in the kitchen. Of this she was positive, and then comes Bridget's statement that she heard Lizzie laugh upstairs as she, Bridget, opened the front door to let Mr. Borden in. Bridget and Lizzie vary greatly about Mr. Borden's movements downstairs. Lizzie seeing him in one apartment only, the sitting room, and not knowing that he went to his own room or took the key to go there. Bridget saw Mr. Borden in the sitting room reading a paper when she left to go upstairs. Lizzie left him lying on the sofa with his slippers on when she went to the barn. The change must have taken 4 or 5 minutes, yet Bridget was upstairs, but between 10 and 15 minutes. This shortens the time in which Lizzie was in the barn to between 6 and 11 minutes. Bridget is very nearly correct in her time, according to the statements of other witnesses. Lizzie also positively denied that she made the statements attributed to her by Mrs. Churchill and Bridget. I don't know, but what she has been killed too, and I am positive I heard her come in. Wouldn't we please go look? Altogether, today was the most important of any since the hearing commenced. It was replete with sensation, for the biggest crowd yet in attendance was in the courtroom. Professor Wood was the first witness. Before he left the stand, there was quite an interesting tilt between counsel. With the other evidence was a little piece of plaster with a blood spot on it. Mr. Jennings didn't want this examined by Professor Wood because it would change the appearance of the spot, and the defense wanted it left as it was in order to show the direction from which the drop of blood came. In order to have it left as it was, the defense admitted that it was a drop of human blood and wanted the assurance of the court that it would be let alone. The court would not give that assurance, and Mr. Jennings said he would keep the piece of sealing in his pocket. Mr. Knowlton then had something to say, and he concluded his remarks with the declaration that he would decline to go on with the case unless the piece of sealing was produced. There was quiet for a few minutes, and then Messrs. Adams and Jennings had a consultation with the result that the latter said he would place the piece of sealing in the custody of the court, providing he would be allowed to file a motion to show why it should not be examined by Professor Wood. Undertaker James Allen Wood, who had charge of the bodies, and John Denny, who worked in John Crow's backyard the day of the murder, next testified, but their evidence was not particularly important. Officer Philip Harrington testified to an important conversation he had with Lizzie the forenoon of the murder, and at the conclusion of his examination, the noon recess was ordered. In the afternoon, Miss White, the stenographer, was sworn as to the transcription of her notes, and then District Attorney Knowlton commenced reading Lizzie's inquest testimony. It took him until almost 4:30 p.m. when he announced that the government's case was closed. The defense called Dr. Dolan as its first witness. He said he completed and filed the records of the Oak Grove Cemetery autopsy last Friday, and they were offered in evidence. Then Lucy Collett and Bridget Sullivan were called, but they were not in the courtroom. Mrs. Churchill stated that Bridget's exact remark about the note was, "Mrs. Borden had a note to go and see someone who was sick. She was dusting the dining room. She didn't tell me where she was going. She usually does." Dr. Bowen was next called, but the only new fact brought out in his evidence was that when he saw Mrs. Borden, and he was the first physician, her arms were crossed beneath her, just below the line of the armpits. His examination was completed at 5 o'clock, and then the courts adjourned for the day until 10 o'clock tomorrow forenoon. Messrs. Jennings and Adams will put on about a half-dozen witnesses, and it is probable that the end will be reached by Wednesday evening or Thursday evening. A great deal depends on the length of the arguments to be submitted this afternoon. Engineer Davidson, who heard two men in a passenger car at Jersey City talk about a friend of theirs having committed the Borden murder, was in town today and saw Messrs. Adams and Jennings. His evidence is unavailable just at present, but may be used later on. Lizzie Borden seemed a great deal more interested in the proceedings of today than at any time during the testimony. When Professor Wood was called, the defendant pushed her head forward to catch a glimpse of the eminent expert. Apparently satisfied with the results of her searching glance, she settled back in the settee, but continued to eye the witness. As the district attorney began to bear up to the important things which the professor was expected to give evidence of, Lizzie's left arm went over the back of the settee, and, clenching her fist, she held it lightly against her sister's shoulder. When the professor said he had found no traces of poison in the stomachs of the murdered couple, the prisoner's cold, pale, gray eyes lighted up most wonderfully, and she bent down and spoke to Emma. This was only the first of many pleasant things which the defendant heard. No blood on the dress nor on the shoes, and no blood on the axe. What a change came over the suspected woman. For the first time since the hearings began, she saw light coming out of the darkness which has enveloped her. The chain of evidence which held her was breaking. She drank in every word the witness said, and quite naturally too. He whom it was supposed would give the most important testimony against her could not do so. Analytical science could not lie. There was no incriminating evidence. And as the professor stepped from the stand, Lizzie Borden breathed the greatest sigh of relief that has come to her since her incarceration. She leaned forward and had a few whispered words with Lawyer Adams. At the afternoon session, the prisoner came into court looking much refreshed. There was a steadiness in her step that was lacking yesterday. When Miss White, the stenographer, was sworn, the prisoner looked inquiringly at her, as if in doubt as to just what was coming. She appeared to pay but little attention to Miss White's statement, and she tried in vain to follow District Attorney Knowlton's rapid reading of her own testimony at the inquest. "That is the case on the part of the Commonwealth," said Mr. Knowlton, as he finished, and again Lizzie looked askance. The prisoner waited most nervously for Judge Blaisdell's ruling on the prussic acid testimony, and when he denied Colonel Adams' motion to throw it out, Lizzie seemed disappointed. Dr. Bowen, the first witness for the defense, saw the bodies of Mr. and Mrs. Borden. District Attorney Knowlton's questions were so put that the ghastliness of the spectacle of the two mutilated corpses was emphasized. Lizzie shuddered as the descriptions were prolonged, and when Mr. Knowlton tried to wring from Dr. Bowen the admission that the witness had shed tears when he saw the bodies, Lizzie's eyes filled and remained moist until she was brought from the courtroom. Maggie Klein, resplendent in blue and red and diamonds, sat on the settee only a few feet from Lizzie at today's hearing. The inimitable songstress made her debut on the professional stage, hardly 200 feet from where her seat was placed. She seemed much more interested in looking at the defendant than in listening to the testimony, although she did both at the same time. When Lizzie's eyes filled, a look from the artist who has turned down McCloskey successfully 1,000 times assured the entire courtroom that her sympathy went out to the prisoner. Lizzie Borden does not sleep during the day or in the early part of the evening. Neither does she read a great deal. She simply shuts her eyes, lays on the sofa, and meditates. Her temples throb, and, at times, she clenches her little white hands most tightly, and her bosom heaves excitedly. Once her form sinks into the little iron-frame cot bed, she dozes off quickly and sleeps soundly. Fall River, August 31st. The general opinion this morning is that the testimony in the Borden case will be closed today. Lizzie Borden entered the courtroom this morning leaning on the arm of Reverend Mr. Jubb, bearing on her face the expression of stoical indifference which has characterized her appearance heretofore in general. The first witness was Marshal Rufus B. Hilliard, who testified to his going to the Borden house on the afternoon of the murder, and to making examination of the premises. Officer Medley, one of the men who were sent to the house, witness said, is now out of town, looking up some evidence presented by Reverend Mr. Buck, following out some supposed clues in connection with this murder. Witness declined to state what the clue is. The witness said Emma Borden said she wanted a thorough examination of all parts of the house, and if there were any apartments unopened, she would furnish the keys. In all these searches, the witness said there was no attempt to hinder him from making a full examination.